The winter of 1945 arrived across Central Europe with a cruelty that matched the collapsing Reich itself. Temperatures plunging to minus 18 degrees Celsius in some forward zones, where American and British armies pushed relentlessly eastward through shattered industrial towns and frozen mud fields that swallowed vehicles whole. Inside temporary containment facilities erected from salvaged timber and corrugated steel sheeting, thousands of German women soldiers, Nachti-Helferinnen, communication specialists, Flak-Helferinnen, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, medical staff from frontline hospitals, sat huddled on bare concrete floors, their field-gray uniforms caked with mud and sleet, their faces hollowed by exhaustion that came not from combat alone, but from the sudden severance of everything they had known. What happened next in those overcrowded wire enclosures would reveal something profound about human dignity under duress, about the smallness of gestures that carry enormous weight when civilization itself has been reduced to rubble and ash. Before we dive into this haunting moment, frozen in military archives and fading testimony, I need you to do something. Pause for just a second and ask yourself what you would have done if you'd been standing on either side of that barbed wire. Then drop your honest answer in the comments below. Because understanding history means confronting the uncomfortable truths about ourselves. The Third Reich had mobilized approximately 450,000 women into uniformed auxiliary roles by early 1945, a figure that represented roughly 4% of total Wehrmacht-affiliated personnel, according to post-war Allied intelligence assessments compiled by the Combined Intelligence Objectives Subcommittee. These were not combatants in the traditional sense. German military doctrine still prohibited women from bearing arms in frontline infantry capacity, but their contributions were tactically indispensable nonetheless. Flak batteries defending Hamburg and Berlin depended on female rangefinders who calculated azimuth coordinates while 88mm shells screamed skyward at B-17 formations, cruising at 23,000 feet. Their mathematical precision often making the difference between a missed salvo and a flying fortress disintegrating in a fireball of aviation gasoline and fragmenting aluminum. Communications networks spanning occupied territories relied on thousands of switchboard operators and radio technicians whose 12-hour shifts inside subterranean command bunkers kept divisional headquarters connected even as Allied artillery plastered the surface terrain into moonscapes of craters and splintered tree lines. Medical orderlies in field hospitals worked under conditions that would have broken peacetime practitioners. Amputating gangrenous limbs by kerosene lamplight, stitching shrapnel wounds with thread requisitioned from parachute silk, watching young Panzer grenadiers bleed out from femoral artery punctures because plasma supplies had been interdicted by Allied air superiority that flew 8,000 sorties daily across contested airspace. By late April 1945, the Wehrmacht's defensive perimeter had contracted to less than one-third its maximum 1942 extent. Squeezed between Soviet armies hammering westward from the Oder River and Anglo-American forces closing from the Elbe, creating a collapsing pocket where military cohesion disintegrated into chaotic retreat columns mixed with civilian refugees fleeing the Red Army's vengeful advance. Into this maelstrom stumbled tens of thousands of female auxiliaries whose units had been overrun, separated, or simply dissolved as commanding officers fled or committed suicide rather than face capture. First Lieutenant Margaret Hastings of the United States Army Nurse Corps, attached to the 102nd Infantry Division processing captured personnel near Brunswick, recorded in her May 7th diary entry. They came in groups of 20 or 30, some still wearing their gray tunics with the Wehrmacht eagle, others dressed in whatever civilian clothes they'd scavenged from abandoned farmhouses. Most were between 18 and 24 years old. Many wept openly. Some laughed in a way that had nothing to do with humor. That nervous laughter, a psychological defense mechanism documented extensively in trauma psychology literature but rarely discussed in conventional military histories, would become the defining characteristic of the initial processing hours, a brittle shield against terror, shame, uncertainty about what Allied captivity would bring. The Geneva Convention of 1929, ratified by 47 signatory nations, including Germany, Great Britain, and the United States, established specific protocols for prisoner of war treatment, including adequate shelter, sufficient rations of at least 2,500 calories daily, medical care, and protection from reprisals or inhumane treatment. Yet the sheer scale of collapse in spring 45 overwhelmed every logistical system the Allies had prepared. By May 8th, VE Day, approximately 7.2 million German military personnel had surrendered across all European theaters, a figure that exceeded Allied prisoner handling capacity by roughly 300%, according to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force logistics reports. Temporary enclosures that had been designed to hold 5,000 detainees for processing before transfer to permanent camps instead became semi-permanent facilities, housing 20 or 30,000 in conditions that violated every standard the Allies officially upheld.
For the women prisoners, conditions carried additional dimensions of vulnerability that military planners had inadequately anticipated. Gender-segregated facilities were theoretically mandated but practically impossible to implement in the chaotic first weeks, meaning women were often detained in mixed enclosures where the presence of male guards, Allied and German alike, created constant tension. British Second Army initially assigned female detainees to enclosure W7 near Lüneburg, a former Wehrmacht training ground surrounded by 12-foot wire fencing and watchtowers manned by troops from the 11th Armored Division. The enclosure measured roughly 800 meters by 400 meters, containing approximately 14,000 women by mid-May, according to administrative logs preserved at the Imperial War Museum. There were no barracks, no tents, no structures except the commandant's office, a converted concrete bunker left from previous German use. Women slept on bare ground, using their threadbare uniform coats as blankets, curling against one another for warmth as nighttime temperatures still dropped near freezing despite the advancing season. Dysentery, pneumonia, and trench foot spread rapidly. Medical Officer Captain Elspeth Morrison, Royal Army Medical Corps, estimated in her official report dated May 19, 45, that approximately 30% of female detainees exhibit symptoms of malnutrition, 15% show signs of tuberculosis exposure, and nearly all demonstrate varying degrees of psychological trauma, ranging from acute stress reaction to full dissociative episodes. The nervous laughter that Lieutenant Hastings had observed became ubiquitous in those first days, a strange soundtrack that echoed across the muddy enclosures whenever guards approached or announcements were made through loudspeakers in heavily accented German. When British quartermasters arrived to conduct initial head counts, groups of women giggled uncontrollably while providing names and service numbers, their eyes darting between each other as if checking whether this reaction was appropriate, whether it would keep them safe or provoke punishment. When American personnel from the Red Cross delivered the first ration distributions, hardtack biscuits and tinned meat stamped with production dates from Ohio factories that seemed impossibly distant, some women laughed while eating, others while watching comrades eat, the laughter mixed with tears that streaked the grime on their hollow cheeks. Psychologist Dr. Wilhelm Hartmann, a German civilian later employed by Allied military government to assist with prisoner welfare assessments, would write in his 1948 study that the laughter represented a fragmentation of emotional response under conditions where terror, relief, shame, and exhaustion existed simultaneously,
creating cognitive dissonance that the psyche could only resolve through incongruous physical expression. Then came the blankets. The operation began in late May, coordinated by the Allied military government's Displaced Persons and Prisoner Welfare Division, which had finally secured sufficient quartermaster resources to address the most critical deficiencies in detention facilities. From depots in Belgium and France, trucks loaded with surplus military blankets began arriving at processing centers across the British and American zones, wool blankets manufactured by mills in Yorkshire and Massachusetts, each measuring 80 by 60 inches, weighing approximately 4 pounds, dyed in olive drab or gray, bearing manufacturer stamps and military inspection seals that verified their compliance with War Department Specification 1944. The blankets had been produced at rates exceeding 120,000 units weekly during peak wartime production, intended for frontline troops, but now surplus after hostilities ceased. Their distribution to prisoner enclosures was logged meticulously. Enclosure W7 received 7,000 blankets on May 23rd, transported by lorries from a depot near Hanover, offloaded by work details of German prisoners under British supervision, then distributed through a systematic process that required each detainee to sign a receipt with her prisoner number.
The distribution began at dawn. Guards moving through the enclosure with stacks of folded blankets, calling out prisoner numbers from typed manifests. What happened next appears in multiple first-hand accounts with remarkable consistency. As the first women received blankets, real blankets, warm and heavy and smelling faintly of mothballs from storage, their initial reaction was that same nervous laughter, a reflexive continuation of the psychological armor they had worn since capture. They laughed while unfolding the fabric, while wrapping it around their shoulders, while showing it to comrades nearby. But within minutes, something broke. The laughter transformed into sobbing, raw and uncontrollable, women clutching the blankets to their faces and weeping with an intensity that startled the distributing guards. Corporal James Whitmore, Coldstream Guards, wrote in a letter to his family dated May 24th, 45, "We handed out the blankets expecting gratitude, maybe, or just silence like usual. Instead, they started crying like their hearts would burst. Tough blokes in our unit who'd fought through Normandy and the Rhine crossing just stood there looking uncomfortable, not knowing what to do. It wasn't a few either. It spread through the whole crowd like a wave. Must have been thousands crying at once. I'll remember that sound until I die." The psychological mechanism underlying this collective breakdown can be understood through the lens of cumulative stress fracture. These women had endured months of escalating privation, reduced rations as supply lines collapsed, aerial bombardment that turned cities into infernos, the terror of military defeat combined with propaganda warnings about Allied savagery, the actual experience of capture, the uncertainty of detention under guard by foreign soldiers whose language they barely understood, the physical misery of sleeping on frozen ground without enough protection. Each stressor had required emotional suppression to maintain basic functionality, building psychological pressure that found release only when something interrupted the survival mode they inhabited. A warm blanket, such a simple thing, an object that represented minimal human consideration, became the trigger that pierced their defensive mechanisms. It was kindness when they expected brutality, comfort when they expected only further deprivation, tangible evidence that they were still recognized as human beings deserving basic dignity rather than abstractions deserving punishment for their association with the defeated regime.
Yet the Allied response to this crisis was itself shaped by complex institutional factors that ranged from genuine humanitarian concern to calculated political considerations. The British government faced mounting pressure from domestic public opinion that wavered between demands for harsh treatment of defeated Germans and discomfort with reports of detention conditions that seemed to violate the democratic values the Allies claimed to represent. The Daily Telegraph published photographs in late May showing emaciated prisoners in British-administered camps, prompting questions in Parliament that Foreign Secretary Anthony Eden addressed on June 4, 45. We are determined that prisoners in our custody shall receive treatment fully compliant with international law and British standards of decency. Temporary shortages have occurred due to the unprecedented scale of surrender, but we are moving urgently to remedy these conditions. American authorities faced similar pressures, particularly as newsreel footage shot by Signal Corps cameramen began circulating in theaters back home, showing crowds of ragged prisoners that bore uncomfortable resemblance to concentration camp victims Americans had just liberated. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander, Allied Expeditionary Force, issued a directive on June 7th emphasizing that all personnel under Allied detention are to receive adequate food, shelter, and medical attention regardless of nationality or former allegiance, consistent with available resources and security requirements. The blanket distributions thus became part of a larger recalibration of detention policy that accelerated through summer 45. Additional shipments of tents arrived, allowing construction of barrack-style shelter before the following winter. Medical staff were reinforced with personnel transferred from combat hospitals no longer needed for battlefield casualties. Ration allocations increased to meet nutritional minimums, supplemented by bulk food purchases from Swiss and Swedish neutral suppliers. For the women prisoners specifically, all female guard units were organized from Women's Auxiliary Air Force detachments at Enclosure W7, reducing the tension inherent in mixed-gender custody arrangements. By August, mortality rates in women's enclosures had dropped from approximately 12 deaths per 1,000 detainees monthly to fewer than 3, a figure that approached natural background rates for institutional populations. Systematic repatriation processing began, with women classified as non-security risks released to civilian status and provided travel documents to return to home districts if those areas were accessible and not under Soviet control. A critical caveat, given that millions from Eastern territories would never see their homes again. The incident with the blankets became something of a footnote in official histories, rarely mentioned in comprehensive accounts of Allied occupation policy or demobilization logistics. Yet for those who witnessed it directly, the memory endured with particular vividness, precisely because it revealed something fundamental about human experience under extreme conditions. Private Eleanor Thompson, serving with the Women's Auxiliary Air Force Detachment at Enclosure W7, would recall in a 1983 oral history interview, "I'd seen plenty of difficult things during the war, bombed-out streets, wounded soldiers, displaced families. But watching those German women cry over blankets hit differently. They'd been the enemy, part of the regime that caused all this destruction, yet in that moment, they were just cold, scared women who'd been sleeping on the ground for weeks. Made me realize how thin the line is between us and them, how quickly circumstances can strip away everything except our basic humanity. Rather humbling, really." What occurred in those detention camps represented a microcosm of post-war Europe's fundamental challenge: how to transition from total war, where entire populations had been mobilized for mutual destruction, back to peacetime coexistence governed by law and basic human rights. The women who laughed nervously until they cried had been participants in a genocidal regime, willingly or otherwise, their labor enabling military operations that killed millions. Their suffering in Allied custody, though genuine, paled beside what Nazi Germany had inflicted on occupied populations and extermination camp victims. Yet the decision to provide them with blankets, adequate food, medical care, and eventual repatriation reflected a conscious choice by Allied authorities to not replicate the cruelty of the defeated enemy, to demonstrate that democratic societies could wage total war without abandoning the principles that theoretically distinguished them from totalitarian adversaries. That choice was imperfect, delayed, and often inadequately implemented. The blankets arrived weeks after they should have. Thousands suffered preventable illness. Some women died in custody from neglect that better organization could have avoided. But the trajectory moved toward restoration of basic standards, however haltingly. In the vast machinery of World War II's conclusion, with its staggering death toll of over 70 million, its restructuring of global political order, its technological and industrial legacies that would shape the remainder of the 20th century, a few thousand wool blankets distributed to cold women in a muddy German enclosure might seem inconsequential. Yet warfare is ultimately conducted between human beings, not abstractions, and its resolution requires recognizing the humanity of even of enemies who supported monstrous causes. The nervous laughter that masked terror, then dissolved into tears when simple kindness appeared, testified to the resilience of human emotion even under conditions designed to numb and suppress it. Those tears, streaming down the grimy faces of women who had helped aim flat guns at Allied bombers and process military communications for a regime whose collapse was overdue, represented a moment when ideology gave way to physical need, when the body's requirement for warmth became more immediate than any political allegiance. The Allied soldiers who distributed those blankets and stood awkwardly watching grown women weep over them learned something that transcended military training, that victory in war does not erase the obligation to recognize the defeated as human beings, and that sometimes the smallest gestures toward basic dignity reveal more about the true character of a civilization than any battlefield triumph ever could.